It's time. You leave it to me. Have some time for yourself. Go on. Taking the opportunity Evelyn had given her, Vita headed out with Mr. Wilde. She stopped for a second by the bevel-edged mirror in the hall, adjusting her dove-grey felt hat and arranging the fur stole around her neck. She inspected her face for signs of tiredness, but her blue eyes were still bright above her high cheekbones, and she patted the honey-blonde curls by her ears, then smoothed the red Helena Rubinstein lipstick Nancy had given her over her full lips. Even though Nancy, with her striking looks, would always be the centre of attention, Vita wasn't so bad, she thought. Opening the front door, she paused on the wide stoop of the Delaney's mansion with its white Doric pillars, wrapping her wool coat around her against the chill of the morning. The sky was blue and the sun was bright above the large silver maple trees that lined the avenue. The mailman was heading up the steps, and he smiled at Vita, touching the peak of his navy blue cap. "Here is one for you today," he said, handing her a pale lilac envelope with her name on the front. "Hand delivery." She thanked him, and he put the rest of the mail in the mailbox by the front door before petting Mr. Wilde. Vita opened the envelope. The first thing she noticed was the embossed gold letterhead spelling out a name. Renata King. Renata King was Irving's mother, and now Irving rose up in Vita's mind's eye. Poor Irving, she thought, remembering how suave and debonair the rich American had seemed when he'd been shopping for his spoilt daughter Daphne at Madame Sacerdote's salon in Paris, how he'd taken a shine to Vita, and how he'd wooed her, wining and dining her and lavishing her with expensive gifts, until she'd given in and agreed to marry him. She'd sincerely hoped that she would develop stronger feelings than the affectionate gratitude she initially felt towards Irving. But they had never materialized, and although it had come as a terrible shock to learn that his quick Paris divorce from his previous wife, Alicia, hadn't been legal, meaning that Vita's marriage hadn't been either, looking back, that revelation had somewhat let Vita off the hook. It was strange, though, being in this awful limbo, not married, but not a divorcee either. It made things very difficult to explain, especially when it came to Bertie. Vita had entirely forgotten that Renata King, her ex-husband's mother, lived here in New York. Irving's daughters, Daphne and Hermione, had given Vita the impression that their grandmother was very much on the side of their mother, Alicia. Daphne, in one of her more toxic moments, had claimed that her grandmama considered Vita to be a gold digger and would never receive her in her home, so Renata King hardly came with a favourable introduction. In fact, Irving himself had always been disparaging about his mother, saying that it was altogether for the best that they lived on separate continents. So, given all of this, why was Renata contacting Vita now? Could it mean that Irving was here, and if so, what then? She felt a shiver of alarm at the mess she'd got herself into. In order to make Vita's predicament socially acceptable to the Delaneys, who were not only morally upstanding, but devout Christians, Vita had foolishly allowed Nancy to handle the matter. She had had several chances at the beginning to tell Nancy the truth about her night with Archie on her honeymoon, and how Irving couldn't possibly be Bertie's father, but she'd been frightened of how Nancy might react. There was no love lost between her friend and Archie Fenwick, and Nancy had made so many assumptions about the circumstances of Vita fleeing her marriage. So she'd stayed silent, while Nancy railroaded her, fabricating a story for her parents that Irving had been nothing more than a brute, claiming that Vita had been lucky to escape her terrible marriage with her life, and that of her unborn child, and that she deserved the Delaney's charity. After all, Nancy had reasoned, her own mother couldn't very well be on the committee at the mission and then turn away a needy person from her very own door. When Vita had protested that the story went too far, and that Irving had actually been more than a gentleman, even offering a gentle reminder that he'd been the one who'd paid for Nancy to leave Paris and straighten herself out in a plush California clinic, Nancy had simply flapped her hand as if that were all ancient history. She didn't like to be reminded that she'd once been...